Yes, thank you, Ryan. As you read, we're going to talk about census data today, which is going to be really fun. We've got a couple of guest speakers who've done a lot of work with their COVES data in conjunction with census data. And I'll just start by saying, like, I'm not necessarily an expert on this. I don't know if Lisa and Beth would call themselves experts on it, probably just people who've done it a few times or a lot of times. There is almost certainly some sort of better, faster way to do some of this than I've found out. If you happen to know, please feel free to share in the chat. Oh, I found a better way to find that table or something, and we can all learn from each other. But we'll try to pass along to you some of our experiences, some of our tips for dealing with what is truly like big, 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 very big data, a lot of data that you can find on the census website, but it's also very fun data. So I'll get us started here. Um, you probably remember back at your, oh, maybe you probably don't remember, back at your original data collection training, we talked about there's like 4 kinds of comparisons that COVES enables you to do. Yourself over time, the aggregate, subset of the aggregate, and then census data. And we have a lot of infrastructure on your COVES dashboard and your raw data for doing the other 3 kinds of comparisons. But up until now, we haven't given a ton of support for this census data comparison. It's been a little bit more up to individual sites. So with this, I hope we can start to do a little bit more of that, just with some tips and tricks and examples, and also a recorded resource you can go back to at any time. So when we say comparing to census data, what are we talking about? Mostly demographics. Of course, information on the COVE survey about, are you a member? What exhibits did you visit? That's not relevant to census data. And the census also collects a lot of information that we don't collect on the COVE survey. It's not relevant to us, but it is very interesting. Stuff about commute time and employment and citizenship and what your household composition is. It's very fascinating stuff, but of course not relevant to us. What is shared, at least in topic, is mostly demographic information. So things like race and ethnicity, ages, genders. On the COVES art survey, language spoken at home is a core question. A few science sites ask that. Educational attainment, household income and disability status. The census does not ask about LGBTQ plus identity, which is a demographic question that we have. Although I feel like I've heard discussions about maybe it, should it, will it? I don't know that it's actually on the list of things that might end up being added to the census at any point, but that is something we collect, the census does not. But when we talk about census data, we're mostly talking about that stuff in the middle, and it's mostly demographics. So where do you start with census data? Well, the census has a couple of websites. There's census.gov, and from my even perusing some of their, they have a lot of materials on their site about how to use the data and tips and tricks for getting started. So one tip is if you're looking for something very simple, just like the population or the like percentage of white only residents of this city, you can go to census.gov/quickfacts and type it in there. I usually end up needing something a little bit more complicated than this for COVES data, but if you want to get a feel for what information is there, or you just want to explore a little bit, it can be a little bit less overwhelming than the main census website's data tables. But if you do need something perhaps more complicated, you would go to the main site is data.census.gov. And this is what the main site looks like. It's this kind of nice graphics, and then there's just a search bar. And I actually learned this when I was preparing for this webinar. There's a couple different inroads into the actual data tables on the census website. So the first one is this big search bar that's highlighted at the top. And the second one that they recommend here is this small advanced search button. And what the actual census recommends is that unless you know specifically what you're looking for, you use the advanced search bar. So that's where I'm going to go. But for me, at least, it was always a little bit more intuitive that I would start typing in the big search bar that's at the top. But you actually might find it a little bit easier to start from scratch with the advanced search. Not that you're necessarily doing anything advanced, but if you type what you need in the big search bar, it might not get you to the right place. It might be some weirdly specific thing that you don't really want. So totally counterintuitive, my comment to the census, but I'm going to go to the advanced search to kind of go take the next step in this exploration process. And once you get into the searching process, where I usually want to start and where I might recommend you start is with geography. So the census has a lot of different ways of categorizing what geography you're looking for. These 10 here are what they say are the most commonly used. So the ones that are highlighted in that solid red color have an exact match in the COVES data, like a variable that is exactly what you want, basically. So like nation, you might not use that because you're looking for your own metro area, your own city. But if you wanted to do just nation, you could look at US visitors from COVES. State, county, county subdivision really is the city and town sort of level, and you could select more than one city or town within a county. But state, city, and county are all data variables that are either on your dashboard or in your raw data, just named exactly as such. So you can do a direct comparison. The sort of dotted lines are some other geographies you might be interested in, but they're not necessarily going to be exactly matched in the COVES data. So zip code tabulation area, as its name suggests, is not exactly the same as zip code. Of course, why would it ever be easy? So zip code, I think there are fewer zip code tabulation areas than zip codes, but for the most part, if you have a list of zip codes, you can probably find a match in this zip code tabulation area geography. So if you want to look by a list of zip codes, that's probably where you'd want to go. And then there's the metropolitan / micropolitan statistical area. Those are super useful, even if they don't match your exact geography that you might be interested in, because they're often referred to in like other data sources, or they're pretty commonly understood sort of standardized metro areas. And you can usually find one that maps to where your museum is, unless it's like truly, truly very rural, but usually we're connected to some sort of metro area, even if it's not a large one. The other four are like census specific things, or maybe they're like much smaller areas. Block is super hyper, like it literally means like a city block, and that's probably not what you need for your data, but I don't know, maybe you do. This is just kind of my guess about what might be most relevant to you. Okay, so then next, once you've kind of figured out what your geography is, and if you don't know, you can always start simple and just look at the state or the city or the county or something. Easy peasy. You start to see this sort of like table view. And when you start clicking on things in the census website, it starts applying filters, kind of like your dashboard. So in this example, I was just screenshotted the Boston, Cambridge, Newton metropolitan statistical area. I've worked with that a lot. I know what it is. It's pretty commonly understood thing. And then you'll start to see all of the different like data tables that you can get to from there. So the data tables, you view the actual data just in numbers by default, not percentages. You just see straight up numbers from the census. But you can also toggle over to maps, which is a nice way to say like, wait, what is the geography that I'm looking at? Or you can choose additional filters by clicking on the places on the map. This is just an example. I'll say it's to the Boston, Cambridge, Newton statistical area. It's quite large. It stretches into New Hampshire even, which is totally accurate for our metro area. But when we at the Museum of Science sometimes talk about the greater Boston area and have it defined on COVES, it's actually more like this little red line. So my new task for myself is to define that in a better way for the way that the census geography has it. You can do a list of zip codes. You can do a list of cities or towns, maybe a list of counties. I did try to do list of zip codes. Full disclosure, you're getting my like total. I explored the census website for this webinar to really test my own, what I usually do. I think our list of zip codes is a little bit too long, and it may have broken the census filters a little bit. So might have to do something different. But I did learn, helpfully, that if you set all that you're filtering up the way you want it, you can just save the URL for a future use and navigate back to it anytime. And the census, this sort of table tool will just reapply everything that you have. So if you have a geography that you really like and you want to go back to, you can just save it. So it's really nice, except the one that I tried to do. So don't try to do that one. But anyway, maybe the next step where you want to go is say, okay, now what topics do I want to explore? So this is a list of, or the start of a list anyway, of some topics that are available on the census website and data tables. I just picked education because it was the first one in the list here, but for COVES, you might also look at income or race and ethnicity, populations. Those are probably some of your likeliest choices there. And then you apply, I would do educational attainment. That's the one that sort of matches the COVES data. And then you'll see that filter gets applied as well. And then from there, your next sort of set of choices is which data source and which table you're looking at. And this is where I'll mention the American Community Survey and the decennial census are different things. You'll see a lot of tables mentioning the American Community Survey. That's because you're like, wait, what is that? That's not the census. It is the census. It's the thing they do every year as opposed to every 10 years. It's a much longer survey. I had actually taken it once before. It came to my house and it was really exciting. It asks about all sorts of things. It's conducted more often, of course. You'll see one for every year, and a much, much smaller sample size. They do not try to do it as a full true census where they survey every single person in the United States. Whereas the decennial census, as the name implies, is conducted every 10 years. It's much, much shorter. And they really, truly do, as it's constitutionally required, attempt to survey every single person in the country, which is, as you obviously know, is a huge undertaking. The three of us, as we were chatting before, over email before this webinar, Elisa and Beth and I, who all are sharing on the webinar today, we often end up using American Community Survey data. So census data and ACS, it's all under the same umbrella, and it's not any lesser quality because it's American Community Survey. Some of the COVES topics are not in the decennial census, so you'll need to look to American Community Survey for the data you want. And then from there is honestly the point where I would hit download table data, because then you can see, okay, here's my Boston, Cambridge, here's educational attainment. But the way that the census organizes it is a lot more granular than the way COVES data organizes it. So you might have to do some adding, summing, combining across multiple categories. Like this is 18 to 24 years and 25 years and over. So then I would just get that data table and start working with it myself. But that's, I hope, sort of a one way of a step-by-step to get to one topic that you might want to look to. And now actually I'm going to go to Elisa to talk about what this might actually look like in practice at your site, or what it looks like at St. Louis Science Center. So Elisa, go ahead and you can just tell me when to switch slides.
All right, thanks, Alex. So yeah, I've been working with comparison to census data for even pre-COVES. So I just wanted to start by giving a little bit of background about what it means for us in St. Louis and the things we look at. So we look at three of the COVES variables: educational attainment, household income, and racial identity. And I'll show you what those comparisons look like. And I just do this once a year with the full annual data. But when I do it, because I'm looking at our regional census data, I only look at the subset of our COVES data that represents our local area visitors. So I'm doing more of an apples to apples comparison. Who among our local visitors, how do our local visitors compare to our local population? And I'm doing everything. I use their zip codes to figure out what counties people live in, and then from there, our metro area. So when I'm looking at local, this is what this means in St. Louis. So as you see in the middle of that map is St. Louis City. St. Louis City is not part of any county. It is an independent city. So there's data specific to the city. And then St. Louis County in red, that's the largest county in Missouri by population. And then our metropolitan statistical area comprises the surrounding counties in both Missouri, the counties in yellow, and Illinois, the counties in green, some of which are quite rural, some of which have combinations of rural areas and more populated areas. The percentages on the map are our distribution of who's coming from where, just in case you're curious, is the map I had available. So when I'm doing comparisons, I'm looking at the city, the county as separate entities, and then also our metro area as a whole, which of course includes the city and the county. So if you want to go to the next slide. So this is what my analyses end up looking like. And I know it's kind of a lot to absorb. So what I do here is I try to show 2 years of our COVES data. So that's the 3 bars on the left. That's the data from 2021. The 3 bars in the middle is the data from 2022. And then the 3 bars on the right is the data from the census. In this case, is the most recently available, which was the American Community Survey data. And what I'm doing is looking at it at 3 different levels. So in each set of 3, the bar on the left is our entire metro area. The bar in the middle is St. Louis County, and the bar on the right is St. Louis City. So that allows us to do comparisons to census with our local visitors at all 3 of those levels. And what you start by noticing, the educational attainment, hopefully it's pretty obvious right away, that regardless of geography, our visitors are much more highly educated than our local population, at least our local visitors anyway. Um, and you see that jump out right away. And I will say, I'm mostly working with the same COVES categories here. The one thing I condense is the some graduate work category. That's usually a really small category. So I include those people with the undergraduate degree as the highest level of attainment. And so I'm combining that in our data because I work with our raw data, even the COVES data. I'm working with the raw data. Um, and and what you can see here is while there's a little bit of difference in the demography based on the census data, it's not a huge difference, but there is a noticeable difference when we look at our visitors. You want to move to the next slide. This is when we start looking at household income. It's a little messier. And again, I'm working with pretty much the same categories that are in COVES. I'm just condensing the topmost categories together. So there's just 200,000 and higher, just because those are, again, relatively small. There's already a lot going on these graphs. And here's where we can start seeing some differences, because if you look on the far right, there are some noticeable differences in the census data from St. Louis City and St. Louis County. Residents in St. Louis City, there's a much larger portion that are lower income compared to the county. And when we look at our local visitor data, we see that same pattern. There are more people of our St. Louis City visitors who are on the lower household income categories than St. Louis County. But when we do the bigger comparison, we still see that overall our visitors tend to be a bit more affluent than the local population as a whole. So that just gives us a better sense of who's coming and perhaps who's not coming from those categories. And then the last example, if you go to the last slide there, is the racial identity. This one gets a little messier. And so I'll explain how I look at it, because I know Beth does something a little bit different. So that's what's going to be nice about the next little summary. So when I look at the data, I'm doing a couple of things with our COVES data. First of all, since the COVES data is a check all that apply, I try to make it a little simpler for my analysis and make everything into single variables. So anyone who identifies in a single racial identity is grouped in that category. Anyone who identifies in more than one racial group, I code as multiracial. And I do that with the census data as well. The census data will show single identity, two racial identities, two or more. It'll break all that down. So I combine all that. And the other thing that's different with the census data is the Hispanic Latino category is a totally separate question in the census data. So for us in St. Louis, as you'll see, it's a fairly small portion of our overall population. So to keep things simple for me, I actually combine that with the census data of all the other categories. That means the bars on the far right, all of them total to more than 100%. Probably couldn't get away with this with a much larger Hispanic Latino population. It would be a little too messy. The other thing, I do condense a couple of the other categories that historically we condensed, because again, not too big for us. But when we start looking at the comparisons, we see that the St. Louis City and St. Louis County racial distribution is very different and it's even different when we branch out to the entire metro area. You can see that 45% of the city is Black. We do not see that in our city visitors. Smaller percentage identify solely as Black. And even amongst, while we see more similarity with the county and the metro area as a whole, sorry, there's a thing on my screen I need to get rid of. There we go. It helps us better identify, again, who's coming, who isn't coming, where are they coming from. The other thing that we've seen consistently with our data is a larger portion of our local visitors identifying as multiracial compared to the census data. So these are things that just sort of help get us a better picture of what's going on in our audiences. So hopefully I've hit on all the notes here. I'm happy to answer questions later about how I work with this. but I think we should turn it over to Beth. Yes, she up next? Because I know she works with this data very differently than I do.
Thanks, Elisa. Yes, I think there's been other presentations where we've found the exact opposite things. And I think it comes down to again, the demographics of our counties. So that influences what we do. So I'm at the Natural History Museums of Los Angeles County. That includes the Natural History Museum and La Brea Tar Pits and Museum. I'm going to focus most of this presentation on the Natural History Museum. So we can move on, Alex. Okay, so the big question here is, are our visitors representative of the LA County population? So we are county funded institutions. That means our bosses are the county supervisors. And we also have a mission to be of, for, and with LA. So this is really our indicator of our local engagement and outreach, right? These are the populations that we can reach, our local visitors. And like Elisa, I limit the comparison to museum visitors who are from LA County. So Elisa said local visitors, I say resident visitors. Sometimes I don't, maybe local visitors is the right way to say it. At the Natural History Museum, and why I focus on this site is that's about 60% of our visitors. We're very local, whereas La Brea Tar Pits, we get more tourists. So let's keep going. So just to show you again how my sample size changes. So here is the response that are not recoded. These are the ones that can sum to more than 100%. So this is for fiscal year, whatever the last one was, 23, where we're at. So I'll just highlight the top two so we can see how they change. So our Hispanic, Latinx population and white populations are nearly identical. If we go to the next one, and I limit it to just US residents, about 90% of our visitors, we see basically they move in opposite directions. Latinx went up 2 points. I think the white went down a point. But if we limit it to LA County, which is the next slide, we see a big difference. So of our survey respondents who live in Los Angeles County, almost half identify as Hispanic or Latinx, and a little over a third identify as white. And and I'll show it later, if we were to recode the sums to 100, we actually get a whopping 15% in the multiple race ethnicity category. And so that takes a pretty big chunk and throws them into one. So we look a little different in LA than some other places. Let's keep going. So I'm going to work with that 519 local visitors. And on the left, this is the graph I want to make. I want to say what percent of our visitors identify as Hispanic or Latinx compared to the county, because, well, even in LA City, we are a majority Hispanic Latino city, which has changed over time. And I want to capture, well, here, so on the census, what I'm looking at is that what they separate out as the ethnicity separate from race. So of Hispanic or Latinx origin, right? So I'm looking at that. And then on the COVES data, I'm focusing on that ethnicity multiple allowed variables. So if you go to the next, if I were just to pop back in that multiple allowed, so just using my dashboard, Lisa does magic with her raw data. I try to use the dashboard. That's where I get my 46%. So this is one of the most straightforward. I take this, that's anybody who identified as Latinx plus anything else. That's the best comparison I can make. And here we can see they're fairly similar. So let's move to the next one. White alum, this is also fairly straightforward. What this means is identifying as white and not identifying with any other category. So the census data, I'm looking at the race variable white without anything else, but I also have to layer that with the ethnicity of not Hispanic. So this is sort of I find it difficult to say the percent of BIPOC visitors we have because of the prefer not to say and the other and the I'm not directly asking that. So instead, I kind of do the reverse and I look at the white alone, which maybe you could say is the opposite. And then on the COVES, unlike the Latinx one, I'm looking at the other variable, the recoded sums to 100% only chose white. So if you flip to the next one, I can get this fairly simply as well. I just pull up that graph, recoded, sums to 100. I get my 27% are white alone. All right, so let's get to the next one. The other categories are a bit more tricky. So looking at our Black visitors, I want to get to this graph on the left, which is a little trickier because the census data, I'm looking at Black, but I'm looking at any ethnicity. So could identify also as Hispanic or not. So I have to do a little maneuvering with the COVES data to get the Black or Black and Hispanic Latinx. So if you go to the next one, the way I've found this without having to use the raw data is to actually edit the widget.
Do you hear?
I don't see the next one.
I think I clicked it
There we
twice.
go.
Is he still at that? Okay, sorry about that.
So I'm going to use the COVES dashboard here. And here I'm going to go back to the multiple allowed variable. And because I'm going to edit this widget every time I filter, it's going to change my number of responses. So I make sure to note I have 519 responses to this question, which is race, ethnicity of LA County visitors. So I'm just going to remember that's my denominator here. And the filters I'll apply, I'll show you next. I'm going to use that multiple allowed. It has to include Black. It cannot include any other category except Black or Hispanic Latinx because I'm not removing the census ethnicity filter. So what does this look like? If we go into the next one, I'm not sure everybody has worked with private pages that you can edit. That's a whole nother thing. But when you're in your dashboard, you can copy the existing one and you can have a page that you edit and go down rabbit holes with yourself. So what I do is I go and I click directly on the widget. I've taken my dashboard, I've limited it to my Los Angeles County residents. And I create this filter, Black alone, for lack of a better title, Latinx okay. And I apply has to include Black, cannot include any of these other things. And Alex, I could ask you another time what's the difference between, I think some of these are maybe older categories that no longer even exist, but there's Asian and Asian or Asian American. And the only one I do not exclude is Hispanic Latinx.
Yeah, I'll just say, despite my yelling at the dashboard to combine those, it sometimes doesn't always quite get there. So yeah, those are older categories that we've changed in the years.
So I just click all those, don't include, including the other, because I'm not going to deep in there. I'm just going to try to get who said this category. But I leave it as there's no filter I have to apply, like, okay, Latinx, yes, no. So where does that get me? So when I filter, so it's a little bit different what I did before, it took away all the ones not in that category and it left me with 26 respondents. So I can't just steal the number from this graph. It's not 100%. So what this shows me is how many people who are Black also identify as Latinx or Hispanic, which is different and interesting in and of itself. But this 26, that becomes my numerator. So this is Black with no other census race categories, not thinking of ethnicity. I take back that and I remember my 519, which is my original sample, and I get 5% as my answer. So if we keep going, in the end, this is one I commonly kind of send up the food chain to show how representative our visitors are of the LA County. So the dark green, that's our museum. The light green, that's the 10 million people who live in Los Angeles County, and how we compare. And I usually say the takeaways, we are pretty representative. You know, I don't know what our margin of error with 519 responses is, but I'm going to say it's pretty close. I mean, it's exactly there with the white category. I'd say the Black residents are underrepresented, even I'd think with the margin of error, and that's something historic and shared by lots of institutions locally and probably beyond. And we do see a little maybe overrepresented in the Asian alone, I'll call that. And just to show that this does paint an interesting picture is to compare it with our other sites. So the last thing I'm going to show you is La Brea Tar Pits. So in case you're like, okay, is that a great way to say how we compare to the county? I think it is, because if we look at our other site, it's very different. So our tar pits survey respondents who are from LA County, which is a long way of saying what Elisa says, local visitors, much easier, are less representative of the broader county population. So that's even we know there's a lot of tourists. We're going to take them away and even say who comes from LA. Well, if we look at the left, we're looking at a third of our local visitors identifies Latinx, with compared to half of the county population. And we also see that white visitors are overrepresented. And then we have similar Black visitors are underrepresented, and a little bit different relationship with the Asian category. I also like to do a graph that shows all three, but for today, not necessary. That's all I got.
Thank you, Beth. And I just will close off the discussion about race and ethnicity categories on the census to mention that, of course, the 2020 census happened just a couple years ago, and I'm sure you may have heard things in the news about it. There's already starting discussions about the 2030 census because, you know, it takes a long time to prepare such a big effort. And it seems like there actually are some discussions within the Census Bureau about changing the ways that those race and ethnicity categories are asked about on the decennial census. One change they're considering making is adding a category for Middle Eastern or North African people. So people of Middle Eastern or North African descent, sometimes just abbreviated as MENA. And then also changing this whole Hispanic, Latinx separate question and taking that ethnicity and folding it into the race question, which a lot of people in that community, they struggle with the separated question. Some people understand it and can answer it fine, and some people really do feel like Hispanic and Latinx is their race, and that is what they want to select on the race question. So that's the way we've been doing it. Of course, if that does change on the census, the way we do these comparisons and the way Beth has to do them will get a little bit different and maybe a little bit easier. But just to say that the census is considering changes, and we are also considering the same types of changes. We had a whole discussion about whether to add Middle East and North Africa to our race question just in our internal team. Of course, changing those questions on the COVES survey is a whole process, but I will say it's a lot easier than changing them on the census. So we may be perhaps seeing some changes there at some point in the future, but just to say that the census changes their questions as well and might make a pretty big change to the race categories. So with that, we've got about 18 minutes left for Q&A. I don't think I missed anything, but I suspect there might be some questions or maybe some other examples or suggestions from the crowd. Actually, Xinyi mentioned the way that you deal with the separated question for Hispanic and Latinx, also in San Francisco, which has a very significant Hispanic Latinx population. I don't want to put you on the spot unless you want to be put on the spot, but I feel like it might be. I think I do something similar to what you do, Xinyi. I don't know if you're willing to come off mute and explain it a little bit. That would be amazing.
Yeah, sure. So I typically work with the raw data and use R to do some data wrangling and data cleaning afterwards. And we noticed that so the Xflow, when we look at COVES data, sometimes people will say that, oh, Latinx visitors have been like underrepresented because we are looking at those only who select Latinx as the only category they selected when they answer to a racial question. So we noticed that after we do some recording, like making sure that we recode whoever select Latinx as one of the racial categories they selected into Latinx Hispanic selected, it would make our demographic breakdown that is more approximate the census data. So it's just like one thing we do if you are comfortable with working with the raw data.
Thank you. Yeah, and as you're kind of sensing, there's not necessarily one exact right way to do this. It kind of depends on your context and the way you interpret the data, but there's a couple of okay, decent right ways to do it. No grand answer from on high.
I'll comment that that's, I think, the same as what we do. I just kind of call it something different. So for Latinx, I'm using that multiple allowed doesn't sum to 100, right? So that first graph that says you could also select any other one, but then when I add white to my chart, I'm using the opposite recoded sums to 100 variable. So I'm also kind of combining. So also my data in the end will not sum to 100%.
Does anyone else have any questions, or I don't know, want to say like, hey, that was wrong, I do it this way? Anything like that? Examples from your own work?
I have a question. I'm jumping in. So, question about how to, like, I understand how complicated all of these things are. I understand that it takes an entire, COVES meeting to walk through, first do this, then do this, and this is why that doesn't sum to 100. Does anyone have any tips for how to relay that back to our teams when they're like, wait, so why can't this add up? Do you have to walk them through this whole deeper dive of how and why we came to the data the way it is, as the whole process? Do you have to unpack that all, or is there a way to kind of gently share it without having to have an hour-long conversation about nitty-gritty details of data? I guess institutional buy-in is the big umbrella.
I'll say depends on how much time I have in a presentation to folks. I usually do like to just point out with the census data and explain the difference between ethnicity and race on the census, and just note that we allow people to choose whichever and however many they want. And so that's kind of, I just emphasize that you're allowed to pick Hispanic, Latinx without choosing another race. You're also allowed to pick as many as you want. And we can show that in separate ways. And I think that last way that I did it, when I separate and just compare one at a time, is helpful than just showing all the bars together. And then I had in my parentheses, I tried to explain what that means, but yeah. Hard.
Yeah, I think I also always, at a minimum, mention that particular difference between COVES and the census, just in case people don't know, or just make some kind of reference to the fact that it's a little bit difficult to do the comparison really easily because of the way those questions are separated. But other than that, I don't find myself getting into too many deep discussions with people about it. When I say census data, they kind of are like, census data, yes, like that is not that they necessarily understand, but they're just like, oh, well, of course, census data is that official data set over there, and it's official. So
Yeah, I'd say my experience is probably pretty similar to Alex's. I mean, I put the caveat on there about the difference with the how the Hispanic Latino data is managed. But aside from having to feel like I want to just walk through and explain all my complicated bars, I I haven't had a lot of deep discussions on this with folks, and I think I don't know if they just accept it because it is, or if, yeah, I don't know, but it is what it is, I guess, in this case.
That's super helpful, kind of leaving the messiness to us evaluators. And everybody else is happy to just have an easy answer that you handed.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, that's what they're looking for. Does it match? Oh, okay, good. And for us in St. Louis, the Hispanic question is not been as big of a question for us. The question about what portion of our audience, particularly those who reside in the city, identify as Black, that's a bigger deal for us because of our particular demography here in St. Louis.
Go ahead, Shinyi.
Yeah, so I have a different question. So because we are in the San Francisco Bay Area, so like oftentimes we're interested in like 9 counties of Bay Area. So I'm wondering if people know how we can use census data, calling out like multiple counties to do a comparison.
Yeah, like advice about doing that within the COVES data or within the census data?
Yeah, so we want to combine all the 9 area county data from the census into one big chunk so that we can compare that 9 county data against our institution's COVES data.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I do with ours.
Yeah, you go ahead. You tell them then. Yeah.
Yeah, so when I'm doing it for the St. Louis area, it's 14 surrounding counties plus St. Louis City and St. Louis County. So when I do it, so basically I get all that data that Alex was showing. So I've got my list of all the counties I need. And on the census site, you can select multiple counties in our case, multiple states even at the same time. And so you get one big table that has all the data for all the counties that you've selected. You can download that, and then in Excel, you can play around with merging them in whatever way you like. You can put them all into one. You can, just simple adding. And so that's what I end up doing for ours. I pull it for all the counties, streamline it for us. I'm differentiating between Missouri and Illinois counties. And yeah, so I've got all those categories. They can all roll up. It's fairly straightforward. You just have to find the counties and the census page.
Thank you.
And I think it's on that like county subdivision geography or something like that.
Yeah, so I actually create the data for our MSA by county rather than pulling down the census data's MSA combined. Because that way I have the raw data that I can make county by county comparisons if I want to. And then I can also roll it up into the one big number.
Mm-hmm. I'll just make a note. I got a different comment on the side about what Beth was showing with having the different widgets on the dashboard for recoded sums to 100%, and then the original race ethnicity categories. I will admit it might not be consistent across dashboards because it's not how they were originally set up. And we did this recoding later and then sort of made some changes, but I'm not gonna like say that it is necessarily exactly the same on everyone's dashboard. But given that we just discussed this, and especially that Beth kind of went through that example using those two, that'll be my next mission with the dashboards, is just to make sure a lot of you do have it, but some of you might not. So if you do go and you see, oh, I don't have that, please let me know. But I'll check through everyone's dashboard just to add it quickly if you don't. It's very simple to add because the variables are already kind of in the background. But if you don't see it, I'd like to make sure you have it if you want to use it. So just a note to everyone there. So don't panic, I can edit easily. Any other questions, comments? Yes, Beth is right. Race is the one that is sort of select all that apply, and then race sum 100 is the one where the categories sum to 100% that I've created within embedded data in the background of the survey. And if there are no other questions, maybe we can sort of mention what next month's webinar is going to be, which will be another, I guess I'll say, topic that we have had on our list for a long time to share with you all about and are going to finally get to, which is working with the decline log data. So, when your data collectors are out there, or you are out there, if you're a data collector also, getting refusals from people, you fill out that demographic sheet, or you look at the different, the response rate that you have. We'll look into a bit about how to, make use of those data and kind of help you look at what your response rate might mean. I don't know if Allison, if you want to say anything more about that. Is Allison here? Or did she get?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey.
I just saw video. I think that pretty well covers it as a sneak peek, just talking about that decline log and the resources that are available and how we've looked at that.
Thank you to all of our presenters. This was super helpful. I know I've seen a couple chats already just saying thank you, but it was obviously a topic that was long overdue, and we hope everyone got a lot out of it. And we'll post it to YouTube soon. Looking forward to seeing everyone next month for our exciting webinar in October.
Happy census data-ing. You can go down so many rabbit holes and have so much fun with it. And I encourage you just to explore and email us with any questions, or even soon, very soon, the member section of our website will be functional, and we can even post questions to your fellow COVES members there much more easily. So stay tuned for that. We'll let you know when it's working, but we are really, really excited for that. So thank you so much, everyone, and we will see you next month.